As a final piece of information, a chunk of information in the South Africa unit, I'd like to talk today about international pressure to end apartheid. We talked about the internal pressure to end apartheid, things like the Defiance Campaign, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, um, the fact that the internal inside of South Africa, the movement turned violent. They banned and suspended um, and jailed people like Nelson Mandela and many others. We talked about the Black consciousness movement as well, which led to a great resurgence of Black South Africans and the Soweto uprising. We talked about all of that. Um, Internationally, though, something that we haven't gotten into at this point is that there's a huge effort to isolate South Africa internationally in three main areas. The first area is individuals and groups. The center of that anti-apartheid movement was called the anti-apartheid movement in Great Britain. A second major area would be governments acting individually or in concert with anti-apartheid organizations. And the final one is the UN, and I want to talk a little bit about the UN next. The United Nations strives to isolate South Africa. How? Well, first, in 1962, it passed a resolution that condemned apartheid, and this would continue. There would be many other resolutions following. In 1974, the UN did the unprecedented thing of actually suspending South Africa from the General Assembly, effectively taking South Africa out of the United Nations. It asked nations to break off diplomatic relations, basically to stop talking with South Africa. It asked nations to boycott, which is to say, to not purchase goods from South Africa. It asked nations to place embargoes, that is to say, banning trade, not selling things basically to South Africa. And it asked nations to impose punitive sanctions on South Africa. So the UN therefore spoke out strongly against the injustices of the South African apartheid system, and it legitimized popular resistance to apartheid. And it promoted anti-apartheid actions by both government and non-governmental organizations. So the United Nations played a critical role in opposing apartheid. Some images that show demonstrations against apartheid. Another major way that South Africa felt pressure from the outside world was culturally. There was an academic boycott starting in 1965 that isolated South African scholars and excluded them from international dialogue. This helped to raise awareness around the world of the issues taking place in South Africa. There was also cultural sanctions that attempted to prevent white South African artists from touring the world. And non-South Africans were basically ostracized, treated kind of like on the outside of things if they tried to perform in South Africa. So there's a lot of pressure to affect the cultural environment in South Africa. And then there was a sports boycott. And this really hurt South Africa because sports is central to life in basically most countries of the world, and South Africa being no exception. South Africa was excluded from international soccer starting in 1961, and the Olympics in 1964, and then from 1970 to 1988. Other sports like cricket and rugby also excluded South Africa from international play because basically apartheid was practiced in the sports area as in all aspects of South African life. So these cultural ways were made to pressure South Africa to not continue its apartheid system. And then another area is economic isolation. There was an oil embargo, a ban on trade, imposed on South Africa starting in 1963. And the United States actually imposed sanctions against South Africa regarding bank loans, the sale of arms, and many other goods, basically refusing to trade with South Africa in those areas. Wouldn't make bank loans. That hurt South Africa significantly. Pressure was put on companies as well as pensions and endowment funds to divest their investments in South Africa. I'm going to talk about investment and divestment on the next slide. Basically, these economic measures severely impacted the South African government and economy and added to a financial crisis, especially in the 1980s, which was the last decade of apartheid. So what is investment and divestment? Well, investment basically means that you buy stocks or bonds to create wealth in the future. And many individuals and institutions, such as universities and companies around the world, had investments in South Africa, which was a rich economy. It still is a rich economy. Well, what is divestment then? Divestment is the opposite of an investment. Basically, it means that you get rid of stocks and bonds. You sell stocks and bonds or investment funds that are based on moral grounds. So in an effort to pressure South Africa to end its apartheid system, there was a lot of pressure on institutions, especially universities and companies, to pull their investments out of South African interests, to divest. The pressure was to divest because there was a desire to get rid of apartheid and end that system. So we come to the end of our journey here with South Africa by talking about two men. The first being F.W. de Klerk, and he was the last white South African president. He freed Mandela after 27 years of imprisonment, after many, many talks that he had with him while he was still in prison. And de Klerk, to his credit, brought an end to the apartheid system. He served as Mandela's deputy president for 2 full years. So he was actually under Mandela when Mandela was elected president in 1994. Mandela was in prison for 27 years, as we said, and he was freed in 1990 by de Klerk, elected president in 1994. A man of peace, he spoke out against blacks taking revenge on white South Africans. He was all about peace and unity in South Africa. So what is that thing there? That is the Nobel Peace Prize. And these two men jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 for their efforts to basically transform South Africa from a racist, segregationist, apartheid country to a place of unity of all races. So to their credit, they won the Nobel Peace Prize in 93. I'm not going to show this video of Mandela being released from prison. It's not terribly fascinating, but if you want to look it up, by all means, just type in Mandela released from prison, and you'll see that he's walking away, and it was a momentous event, a lot of press coverage. Mandela was, in fact, elected president in 1994, and you see him voting there. For the first time, black people could vote in South Africa in the 1994 election, and there he is with his victory face. So that's what we're going to talk about. The final thing I'm going to be looking at is what's going on in South Africa today. How is South Africa years after the end of apartheid?